The October wind cut through the Colorado mountains like a blade, carrying with it the promise of an early winter that would test the survival skills of every living creature in the high country. Jake Morrison pulled his coat tighter as he guided his horse along the narrow trail that wound through the aspen groves, their golden leaves shimmering in the pale afternoon light like scattered coins against the darkening sky. Jake was a man of 43 years, worn lean by 2 decades of working cattle in some of the most unforgiving terrain in the territory. His ranch, the Broken Arrow, sat in a valley 20 miles from the nearest settlement, a place he had chosen for its isolation after losing his wife and young son to cholera 5 years earlier. The solitude that had once been a blessing now felt like a burden, but Jake had grown accustomed to the silence and the company of his thoughts. He was returning from Silverton with winter supplies when he heard the sound that would change everything, the crack of a whip, followed by harsh laughter and what sounded like a woman's muffled cry of pain. Jake reined in his horse and listened, his weathered face tightening with concern. The sounds were coming from somewhere ahead, beyond a stand of pine trees that blocked his view of the trail. Moving carefully to avoid making noise, Jake dismounted and led his horse closer to the source of the disturbance. What he saw when he peered through the trees filled him with a cold rage that surprised him with its intensity. 3 men in the rough clothing of prospectors or drifters had set up a crude camp beside the trail. Between 2 trees, they had strung a rope from which hung the shackled form of an Apache woman. The woman appeared to be in her late 20s, with long black hair that fell around her shoulders like a dark curtain. Her traditional buckskin dress was torn and dirty, and her wrists were raw from the iron shackles that bound her to the rope above her head. Despite her obvious pain and exhaustion, she held herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength that could not be broken by physical abuse. The 3 men were taking turns with a bullwhip, striking her legs and back while making crude jokes about their plans for her. Jake could see that they had been drinking heavily, which made them unpredictable and even more dangerous than they might otherwise have been. The leader of the group, a bearded man with the scarred hands of someone who lived by violence, was describing in graphic detail what they intended to do with their captive once they tired of their current entertainment. Jake counted 3 rifles leaning against a nearby tree, along with various handguns and knives that suggested these men were well armed and accustomed to trouble. His own weapons consisted of a Colt .45 on his hip and a Winchester rifle in his saddle boot, adequate for most situations, but potentially insufficient against 3 determined opponents who had the advantage of position and numbers. Jake Morrison had faced difficult situations before, but nothing quite like this. Every instinct told him to ride away and avoid trouble that wasn't his business, but the sight of the Apache woman's suffering made retreat impossible. He thought of his wife Sarah, who had possessed the same quiet strength he saw in this stranger, and he knew he couldn't live with himself if he abandoned someone who needed help. The tactical situation was challenging, but not hopeless. The 3 men were drunk and overconfident, their attention focused entirely on their victim. They had made camp in a small clearing that offered good visibility, but also left them exposed to anyone approaching from the tree line. More importantly, their weapons were not immediately at hand, giving Jake a brief window of opportunity if he moved quickly and decisively. Jake checked his Colt to ensure all 6 chambers were loaded, then worked his way around the camp's perimeter until he could approach from the side where the rifles were stacked. The Apache woman noticed his movement first, her dark eyes widening slightly as she spotted him moving through the shadows. To her credit, she gave no sign that might alert her captors to his presence. The bearded leader raised his whip for another strike when Jake stepped into the clearing with his gun drawn. "That's enough," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had faced death before and made his peace with whatever might come. The 3 men spun around in surprise, hands moving instinctively toward weapons that were suddenly too far away to reach. The leader, who Jake now saw was missing 2 fingers on his left hand, sneered with the bravado of someone too drunk to properly assess the danger he faced. Well, the man said, swaying slightly as he tried to focus on Jake's face. "Look what we got here, boys. Another do-gooder who thinks he can tell honest working men how to conduct their business." He gestured toward the Apache woman with mock courtesy. "This here's a legitimate captive, taken fair and square. We got papers says she's a runaway from the reservation." Jake's eyes never wavered from the 3 men, but he could see from his peripheral vision that the woman's papers were obviously forged documents that wouldn't fool anyone sober enough to read them properly. More telling was the fresh blood on her wrists and the obvious signs that she had been beaten repeatedly over several days. Maybe so, Jake replied evenly. But the way I see it, you boys have been drinking a little too much and having a little too much fun. Time to let the lady go and move along before someone gets hurt. His thumb rested on the hammer of his Colt, ready to cock and fire in one smooth motion if the situation escalated. The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like hours as each man calculated his chances and weighed his options. The leader's two companions were clearly having second thoughts about their situation, recognizing that their casual brutality had suddenly become a matter of life and death. But the leader himself was too proud and too drunk to back down gracefully. "You picked the wrong fight, stranger," he snarled, his hand edging toward the knife on his belt. 3 against 1 ain't good odds for a man who thinks he's some kind of hero. He glanced meaningfully at his companions, clearly expecting them to support him in whatever violence was about to unfold. Jake had been in enough fights to recognize the moment when talking ended and shooting began. He saw the leader's muscles tense for the grab at his knife and reacted with the smooth precision of long practice. The Colt came up and roared, the heavy .45 slug taking the bearded man in the shoulder and spinning him around to collapse against the tree where the rifles were stacked. The other 2 men froze as Jake smoothly cocked his weapon and shifted his aim between them. "Your friend there is going to live if he gets proper medical attention," Jake said calmly. "Whether you boys live to see tomorrow depends on how smart you are in the next few minutes." The wounded leader was cursing and trying to reach his knife with his good hand, but the shock of the bullet had sobered him enough to realize that his situation had changed dramatically. His companions were looking at each other with the expression of men who suddenly understood they had been following a fool into a situation that could easily get them killed. "Take his weapons," Jake ordered the 2 uninjured men, nodding toward their fallen leader. "All of them. Then step back where I can see your hands." As they reluctantly complied, Jake moved toward the Apache woman, keeping his gun trained on the 3 captors while reaching for the keys to her shackles that hung from the wounded man's belt. The woman said nothing as Jake unlocked her restraints, but her dark eyes watched his face with an intensity that suggested she was reading his character as carefully as he had assessed the tactical situation. When the shackles fell away, she rubbed her raw wrists and stood with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to moving silently through difficult terrain. "You speak English?" Jake asked quietly, still keeping watch on the 3 men while the woman gathered her few possessions from where they had been scattered around the camp. "I speak English," she replied, her voice carrying a slight accent but perfectly clear. "My name is Aiyana. It means eternal blossom in my language." She paused, studying his face. "You risk much for stranger. Why you help Apache woman?" Jake considered her question as he bound the wounded man's shoulder with strips torn from a blanket, applying enough pressure to stop the bleeding but not enough to cause unnecessary pain. "My wife used to say that how we treat folks who can't help themselves is what separates civilized people from animals," he finally answered. These men were acting like animals. Aiyana nodded slowly, understanding passing between them that went beyond mere words. She had clearly endured terrible treatment at the hands of her captors, but her spirit remained unbroken. As she moved around the camp gathering supplies that might be useful, Jake noticed that she favored her left leg and that there were other signs of abuse that spoke to days or perhaps weeks of suffering. "Where are your people?" Jake asked as he finished tending to the wounded man. The other 2 captors sat sullenly against a tree, their hands bound with their own rope, waiting to see what would happen next. "My band was attacked by soldiers 2 moons ago," Aiyana explained, her voice carrying the controlled grief of someone who had lost much. "I was gathering herbs in the high meadows when they came. When I returned, everyone was gone, killed, or taken to reservation." She paused, her dark eyes reflecting memories too painful to fully express. "These men found me trying to follow the trail. They said they would help me find my people." Jake felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same rage that had filled him when he first witnessed the casual cruelty being inflicted on this woman. Men who would prey on someone already devastated by loss represented the worst of what frontier life could produce. Predators who saw others' misfortune as opportunity for their own pleasure or profit. The practical question now was what to do with the 3 captors. The nearest law enforcement was in Silverton, 2 days' hard ride through mountain country that would soon be impassable due to snow. The wounded man needed medical attention, but he and his companions had clearly committed serious crimes that couldn't simply be ignored. Jake made a decision that reflected both practical necessity and frontier justice. He would take their weapons and horses, leaving them enough supplies to survive but not enough to easily pursue anyone. The wounded man would have to be helped by his companions, which would slow them considerably and give Jake and Aiyana time to put distance between themselves and any thoughts of revenge. "You boys are going to walk to Silverton," Jake announced, checking the loads and the rifles he was confiscating. "Your friend there needs a doctor, and you need to think real hard about the choices you've been making." He paused, fixing each man with a direct stare. "If I see any of you again, or if I hear you've been bothering other folks the way you bothered this lady, I won't be nearly as generous as I'm being today." As they prepared to leave the campsite, Aiyana approached Jake with an expression of concern that had nothing to do with her own situation. "You take weapons, horses from white men," she said quietly. "This make you outlaw in eyes of your people. They will say you help Apache against white men." Jake had already considered this possibility, understanding that his actions could easily be misinterpreted by authorities who might see any assistance to Indians as evidence of treason or criminal conspiracy. The three men would certainly claim that they had been legally pursuing a runaway reservation Indian, and their word would likely be accepted over that of an Apache woman and the white man who had helped her. "I'll deal with that problem when it comes," Jake replied, loading the confiscated weapons onto his pack horse. "Right now, I'm more concerned about getting you somewhere safe before this weather turns worse." He gestured toward the heavy clouds that were building over the high peaks, promising snow that could trap them in the mountains if they didn't move quickly. Aiyana studied his face with the intense scrutiny of someone whose life had depended on reading people accurately. What she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded and accepted his help mounting one of the horses they had taken from her captors. Despite her injuries, she sat the animal with the natural grace of someone raised in a culture where horsemanship was essential for survival. The journey to Jake's ranch took 2 days through increasingly hostile weather. Snow began falling on the first night, and by morning the trail was covered with several inches of white powder that made travel treacherous for both horses and riders. Jake led them by memory through country he knew intimately, finding shelter in caves and overhangs that provided protection from the worst of the storm. During the long hours of travel, Aiyana told Jake more about her people and the life that had been destroyed by the military raid. Her band had been one of the peaceful groups that tried to maintain traditional ways while avoiding conflict with the encroaching white settlements. They had harmed no one, raided no ranches, and asked only to be left alone in the high country where they had lived for generations. "My husband was medicine man," she explained as they sheltered in a cave during the worst of the snowfall. "He tried to heal not just bodies, but also anger between Apache and white men. He believed there was path to peace if both sides could learn to see each other as human beings instead of enemies." Her voice carried the pain of loss that time had not yet begun to heal. Jake listened to her story with growing understanding of the complexity of the situation facing both Indians and settlers in this disputed territory. Men like Aiyana's husband represented the possibility of peaceful coexistence, but they were voices crying in the wilderness against the tide of fear and hatred that seemed to dominate relations between the two cultures. The Broken Arrow Ranch sat in a valley protected on 3 sides by steep ridges that provided natural windbreaks against the worst mountain storms. Jake had built the main house and outbuildings himself, using logs cut from the surrounding forest and stone quarried from the canyon walls. It was a substantial operation that could support several hundred head of cattle during good years, though the isolation made it vulnerable to both natural disasters and human threats. As they rode down the final slope toward the ranch buildings, Jake felt a familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied his return home. The place held too many memories of Sarah and little Thomas, reminders of the family life that disease had stolen from him. The empty corrals and silent house spoke of a loneliness that had become his constant companion over the past 5 years. Aiyana said nothing as Jake helped her down from her horse, but her experienced eyes were taking in every detail of the ranch's layout and condition. She could see that it had been built by someone who understood both the opportunities and challenges of mountain ranching, but also that it had been neglected in ways that suggested the owner's heart was no longer fully invested in its success. The main house was larger than she had expected, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and windows that looked out over the valley in all directions. The furnishings were simple but well made, suggesting a man who valued quality and durability over ornamentation. Most telling were the photographs on the mantelpiece. A beautiful woman, and a young boy who bore Jake's features that explained much about the sadness she had sensed in him. "Your family," Aiyana said simply, understanding passing between them without need for detailed explanation. Jake nodded, his throat tight with emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel. "Cholera took them 5 years ago. Been running this place alone ever since, though I'm not sure why anymore. He moved to build up the fire, needing something to do with his hands while he talked about things he usually kept locked away. Aiyana settled herself on the couch, wincing slightly as her injuries reminded her of the ordeal she had endured. Grief is like winter, she said quietly. It seemed like it will never end, but spring always come. Your wife and son, they would not want you to stop living because they cannot live with you. Her words carried the wisdom of someone who had experienced profound loss and found ways to continue despite the pain. Jake found himself talking to her about Sarah and Thomas in ways he hadn't spoken to anyone since their deaths, sharing memories that brought both pain and unexpected comfort. As evening fell and the snow continued to accumulate outside, they settled into a domestic routine that felt surprisingly natural despite the strangeness of their circumstances. Aiyana insisted on helping with the cooking despite her injuries, preparing a meal that combined frontier staples with traditional Apache seasonings she had gathered during their journey. Over the following days, as the storm raged outside and travel became impossible, Jake and Aiyana fell into a pattern of shared labor and companionship that began to heal wounds in both of them. She possessed knowledge of medicinal plants and healing techniques that proved invaluable in treating her own injuries. But more importantly, her presence began to fill the empty spaces in Jake's house and heart that had been echoing with loneliness for too long. Aiyana was not content to simply recover from her ordeal while Jake waited on her. Despite his protests, she insisted on contributing to the household in ways that went far beyond mere gratitude. She mended clothing that had been left unrepaired for months, organized supplies with an efficiency that spoke of experience managing resources in difficult circumstances, and prepared food that was both more nutritious and more flavorful than anything Jake had eaten since Sarah's death. More significantly, she began to notice problems around the ranch that Jake had either ignored or failed to see. Fences that needed repair, buildings that required maintenance before winter damage became serious, and organizational systems that could be improved to make the operation more efficient. Her suggestions were offered tactfully, but they revealed an understanding of ranch management that impressed Jake with its practical wisdom. You know a lot about running cattle for someone who lived with a hunting band, Jake observed one evening as they planned repairs to the main barn. Aiyana smiled, the first truly relaxed expression he had seen on her face since they met. Apache learn by watching, by listening. When soldiers drive us from traditional lands, we watch how white ranchers work. Some knowledge useful for survival, even if we're not allowed to practice it ourselves. As the days passed, Jake found himself looking forward to their conversations by the fire in the evening, when Aiyana would share stories of Apache culture and traditions while he talked about his experiences building the ranch and raising cattle in the high country. Their different backgrounds created opportunities for learning that neither had expected, breaking down stereotypes and misconceptions that years of conflict had created. The weather began to clear after a week of steady snow, revealing a landscape transformed into a winter wonderland that was both beautiful and treacherous. Jake knew that he would soon need to check on his scattered cattle herds, many of which were sheltering in protected valleys that required dangerous travel to reach. It was work that couldn't be postponed much longer, regardless of the risks involved. "I have to ride out tomorrow and start checking on the cattle," Jake announced as they planned the next day's activities. "Some of them are in places where they can't survive much longer without help." He paused, then added, "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need to. The house is yours until you decide what you want to do next." Aiyana studied his face with the careful attention she gave to all important decisions. "Where you go, I go," she said simply. "Two people work better than one in snow country. Also," she added with a slight smile, "Apache know things about finding animals in winter that might be useful to cattle rancher." The next morning dawned clear and bitter cold, with temperatures that turned breath to vapor and made metal tools painful to touch with bare hands. Jake and Aiyana prepared for their expedition into the high country with the methodical care of people who understood that mistakes in such conditions could easily prove fatal. They loaded pack horses with hay and grain for stranded cattle, along with tools for cutting through ice and clearing snow from water sources. Aiyana's knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable as they worked their way through the snow-covered landscape. She could read the subtle signs that indicated where animals might seek shelter, and her understanding of wind patterns helped them avoid areas where drifting snow might trap their horses. More importantly, her presence seemed to calm the cattle they encountered, as if the animals recognized something familiar in her quiet confidence. They found the first herd sheltering in a box canyon where Jake had expected them to be, But the situation was worse than he had feared. Snow had blocked the canyon's outlet, trapping nearly 50 head of cattle in an area where the natural forage had been exhausted days earlier. Without immediate help, the animals would begin dying within hours. Working together with an efficiency that surprised them both, Jake and Aiyana began the laborious process of breaking trail through the deep snow while simultaneously feeding the trapped cattle. It was backbreaking work that required careful pacing to avoid exhaustion, but Aiyana's endurance proved equal to Jake's despite her smaller size and recent injuries. As they worked, Jake found himself impressed not just by Aiyana's physical capabilities, but by her understanding of animal behavior and her instinctive knowledge of how to work with livestock. She seemed to anticipate what needed to be done before he asked, creating a partnership that was far more effective than the sum of its individual parts. "Where did you learn so much about cattle?" Jake asked during a brief rest break, watching as Aiyana calmed a particularly agitated bull with nothing more than her voice and careful body language. "Apache must learn many things to survive," she replied, scratching the bull behind his ears as he gradually relaxed under her touch. "When white men bring cattle to our lands, we watch how they handle animals. Some knowledge useful, some not. Animals, same everywhere, they respond to confidence and respect, not to fear and anger." It took 3 days to reach all of Jake's scattered herds and ensure their survival through the remaining winter months. The work was exhausting and dangerous, with constant risks from weather, terrain, and the unpredictable behavior of stressed animals. But it was also strangely fulfilling, as Jake rediscovered the satisfaction of working with someone who shared his commitment to the welfare of the creatures under their care. More significantly, the shared labor began to transform their relationship from that of rescuer and rescued to something approaching true partnership. They developed an easy working rhythm that required minimal communication, each anticipating the other's needs and responding accordingly. Trust grew between them like a bridge built one stone at a time, creating a foundation for something neither had dared to hope for. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Jake and Aiyana settled into a domestic partnership that brought new life to the Broken Arrow Ranch. The changes were subtle at first: better organization of daily tasks, more efficient use of resources, and a general sense that the place was being cared for by people who had both the knowledge and the motivation to make it prosper. Aiyana's influence extended far beyond household management. Her understanding of the natural world helped Jake make better decisions about when and where to move his cattle, how to read weather patterns more accurately, and which plants could provide emergency forage during difficult periods. She introduced him to Apache techniques for water conservation and soil management that proved surprisingly applicable to cattle ranching in the high country. But perhaps most importantly, her presence began to heal the emotional wounds that had kept Jake isolated from any meaningful human connection since his family's death. She didn't try to replace Sarah in his affections, understanding that such substitution was neither possible nor desirable. Instead, she offered companionship and partnership that allowed Jake to imagine a future that contained something other than mere survival. Their relationship deepened gradually, built on shared work and mutual respect, rather than the passion of youth. They were both mature adults who had experienced profound loss and found in each other not a fantasy of perfection, but the reality of two damaged people helping each other heal. When they finally acknowledged that their partnership had become something more intimate, it felt like a natural progression rather than a dramatic change. The transformation in Jake's attitude toward life became apparent to everyone who knew him. When he rode into Silverton for supplies, townspeople remarked on the change in his demeanor. He seemed more engaged with life, more interested in planning for the future rather than simply enduring the present. Some suspected he had found female companionship, but none guessed the true nature of his situation. The secret couldn't be kept indefinitely, however. In late spring, a group of Apache riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the ranch, moving with the deliberate purpose of people conducting important business. Jake's first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but Aiyana placed a restraining hand on his arm. "My people," she said simply, her voice carrying a mixture of joy and apprehension. "They have been searching for me since the snow melted. Someone must have seen smoke from our chimney and recognized it as different from white man's fire." The lead rider was a man of perhaps 50 years, with the bearing and authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions for his people. He rode down toward the ranch house with careful dignity, his eyes taking in every detail of the scene while his hand rested casually on the grip of a rifle across his saddle. Behind him came a dozen other riders, including several women and 2 teenagers who appeared to be siblings. Jake realized with growing understanding that this was not a war party but a family group, people who had come to reclaim one of their own after months of uncertainty about her fate. The reunion between Aiyana and her people was emotional beyond words, with tears and laughter mingling as family members who had feared her dead embraced her with the fierce joy of those who had been given an unexpected gift. Jake watched from a respectful distance, understanding that this moment belonged to them and that his role was simply to witness their happiness. The leader of the group introduced himself as Manuelito, Aiyana's uncle and the elder responsible for her welfare since her husband's death. His English was limited but adequate for basic communication, and his initial attitude toward Jake was cautious but not hostile. He had clearly heard enough about the situation to understand that Jake had saved Aiyana's life and protected her during the difficult winter months. "You have cared for my sister's daughter when she had no one else," Manuelito said formally, his weathered face grave with the responsibility of speaking for his people. "This creates debt between us that must be properly acknowledged. Apache, do not forget kindness shown to our family." What followed was a discussion that took place partly in English and partly in Apache, with Aiyana serving as translator for the more complex concepts that needed to be communicated. Jake learned that the Apache band had been searching for Aiyana since the spring thaw, following every lead and investigating every report that might help them locate their missing family member. More significantly, he discovered that their arrival at his ranch was not simply a rescue mission but the beginning of something far more complex. Aiyana had apparently told them about her life at the ranch and her relationship with Jake, creating a situation that required careful negotiation between very different cultural traditions. "Aiyana is widow with no children," Manuelito explained, through the careful translation. "In our way, her uncle must approve any new marriage, or she remains with her family. But she tells us she has found good man who treats her with respect and honor. This is not common thing between Apache and white people." Jake felt his heart racing as he began to understand the implications of what was being discussed. The Apache weren't simply here to take Aiyana away, they were here to evaluate him as a potential permanent partner for their family member. It was a responsibility he had never expected to face, but one that suddenly seemed more important than anything else in his life. The negotiations that followed took 3 days, during which Jake was subjected to careful scrutiny by every adult member of the Apache band. They evaluated not just his character and intentions, but his practical ability to provide for Aiyana and any children they might have. His ranch was examined in detail, his livestock assessed, and his knowledge of the country tested by people who had been living in it far longer than he had. More challenging was the cultural education he received about Apache marriage customs and the expectations that would govern his relationship with Aiyana if their union was approved. He would not simply be marrying a woman, he would be joining a family network that included responsibilities and obligations he had never imagined. In the end, it was Aiyana herself who made the decisive argument during a private council meeting from which Jake was excluded. When she emerged, her face glowing with happiness, she brought news that would transform both their lives. "My people have agreed to our marriage," she announced, her English formal with the importance of the moment. "But there are conditions that must be met. You will be adopted into our band as my husband, which means you accept responsibility not just for me, but for our entire family group. In return, they will help you build the ranch into something greater than you could achieve alone." What followed was unlike anything in Jake's experience or in the recorded history of relations between Apache bands and white settlers in the territory. Instead of losing Aiyana to her people, Jake found himself gaining an extended family whose skills and knowledge transformed his struggling ranch into one of the most successful operations in the region. Apache expertise in reading weather patterns, understanding animal behavior, and managing resources in harsh environments proved perfectly applicable to high country ranching. More importantly, their willingness to work cooperatively on shared goals created a labor force that could accomplish tasks impossible for one man working alone. The marriage ceremony itself combined elements of both cultures, creating something new that honored the traditions of both peoples while acknowledging the unique circumstances that had brought them together. Jake found himself not just gaining a wife but becoming part of a community that valued his contributions while expecting him to respect their ways and customs. Over the following years, the Broken Arrow Ranch became a legend throughout the territory, a place where Apache families lived and worked alongside a white rancher, creating prosperity that benefited everyone involved. Children grew up speaking both languages, learning both sets of survival skills, and understanding that cooperation was stronger than conflict. Jake never forgot the day he had chosen to help a suffering woman rather than mind his own business. That single decision had led him from the isolation of grief to the warmth of family, from the struggle of mere survival to the satisfaction of genuine prosperity. Aiyana had given him back his future, but perhaps more importantly, she had given him back his faith in the possibility that people of goodwill could find common ground, even in a world that seemed determined to keep them apart. When visitors came to the ranch and marveled at its success, Jake would sometimes tell them about the day he found Aiyana in Shackles and made the choice that changed everything. But he always ended the story the same way. The Apache have a saying that when you save someone's life, you become responsible for them forever. What they don't tell you is that sometimes the person you save ends up saving you right back. The turquoise bear pendant that Aiyana had given him on their wedding day became a symbol that their children and grandchildren would carry for generations, a reminder that love can bridge any divide, and that courage is simply the willingness to do what's right regardless of the cost. Their legacy lived on in the ranching techniques they developed, the family traditions they created, and the proof they offered that two peoples could choose cooperation over conflict and create something beautiful in the process.